In the quiet neighborhoods of California, during the mid-1970s, a shadow began to creep into everyday life. Families who once left their doors unlocked now checked their windows twice. Couples who had built safe, there were suburbs, felt an unease that seemed to follow them home. The fear came not from rumor, but from a string of mysterious crimes that grew more sinister with each passing year. It began with break-ins. Small items disappeared. Coins, jewelry, photographs. The thief seemed less interested in wealth than in knowing his victims. People spoke of the ransacker, a prowler who rifled through drawers, scattering belongings as if searching for something more personal. The sense of violation was chilling, but no one could yet predict what was to come. Then came the nights when women awoke to the sound of footsteps in their own homes. A masked figure stood in the dark, armed, calm, and cruel. Victims were bound, blindfolded, and assaulted while their partners were forced to listen. Tied helplessly in the same room. From Sacramento to Contra Costa, from Alameda to Yolo County, the terror spread like wildfire. The attacker seemed to know the streets, the homes, even the habits of those he targeted. His victims ranged from young teenagers to women in their 40s, and his crimes numbered in the dozens. Residents called him the East Area Rapist, though for years no one could grasp his true reach. The violence did not stop with assault. In Southern California, entire households were shattered. A respected doctor and his partner, a young couple in Ventura, newlyweds in Dana Point, and a teenage girl in Irvine. Each was found murdered in their own home. Again and again, the killer struck silently, leaving behind broken families and bewildered investigators. At least 13 were taken in this wave of violence, though the exact toll will never be fully known. The press began calling him the original Night Stalker, a figure whose cruelty seemed endless. For decades, detectives across different counties struggled to connect the dots. They shared files, compared notes, and preserved every trace of evidence they could. Yet the crimes stretched from the mid-1970s into the mid-1980s, and the man behind them disappeared into the ordinary life of the state. Whole generations grew up in the shadow of the fear he had created, with no answers and no closure. By the turn of the new century, science offered the first glimpse of truth. DNA revealed that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. Still, the name remained unknown. It was not until investigative genealogy emerged that a path forward appeared. Detectives entered the killer's DNA into public ancestry databases, tracing distant relatives and building family trees until their search narrowed to one unlikely figure. When the knock finally came on his door, in the spring of 2018, the man was no longer young. He lived quietly in a suburb, a retired police officer, with neighbors who described him as unremarkable, even ordinary. But beneath that facade lay the secret identity that had haunted California for more than 4 decades. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. To the world, he would forever be known as the Golden State Killer. On a crisp December morning in the year 2000, the quiet of Benedict Canyon in Los Angeles was broken, not by the sound of holiday cheer, but by discovery both chilling and unexpected. Inside a modest home, the body of Susan Berman, a writer and journalist known for her wit and connections, lay face down on the carpet. A single gunshot to the back of the head had ended her life. Her beloved dogs circled the scene, confused and restless, as if sensing that something was terribly wrong. At first glance, many whispered about her past. Susan was the daughter of a Las Vegas mob figure, and she had written about the underworld with a voice both affectionate and critical. Perhaps people thought old debts or shadowy enemies had come calling. The way she was killed, execution style, without a sign of forced entry, seemed to bear the hallmark of organized crime. Yet the clues pointed elsewhere. Detectives found a letter sent to the Beverly Hills police. It was stark and unnerving, one word typed inside: cadaver. Even stranger, the envelope bore a misspelling, Beverly, with an extra letter. It seemed both deliberate and careless, like the calling card of someone close enough to care, but desperate to distance themselves. Susan's friends described her as loyal and fiercely protective of those she loved. She had built her career writing about her family's mob legacy and the cultural landscape of her time. But in the weeks before her death, she confided in some that she feared being drawn into an old mystery, one that dated back to the disappearance of another woman decades earlier. She had received money from a long-time confidant and had been asked to keep quiet. When word spread that investigators from New York were preparing to speak with her, it seemed as though the past was closing in. For years, the murder remained unsolved. Files gathered dust, though detectives kept watch for new evidence. Then, in the mid-2010s, a true crime documentary series reignited public interest. The series explored a wealthy, hare's trail of suspicion across 3 different tragedies: the vanishing of his wife in the early 1980s, the violent death of a neighbor in Texas, and the execution of Susan Berman. Viewers sat transfixed as the story unfolded on their screens, and in its final episode, a hot microphone captured the suspect muttering to himself words that sent chills through millions. "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." The arrest came swiftly after the program aired. Investigators had connected the dots. The payments to Susan, her role as a confidante who knew too much, and the peculiar cadaver note whose spelling matched a letter sent years earlier by the same hand. The truth was undeniable. The killer was not a mobster from her father's world, nor a stranger from the shadows. It was her old friend, Robert Durst, the eccentric real estate heir she had once protected. In 2021, he was convicted of Susan Berman's murder and sentenced to life in prison. His arrest and conviction revealed that the threat had always been close, hiding in plain sight, and that Susan's loyalty had cost her the ultimate price. On warm Saturday nights in the summer of 1973, Swansea's streets filled with the laughter of teenagers, heading out to clubs and dances. Music drifted from open doors. Lights shimmered in the night, and the city seemed alive with promise. Yet behind that ordinary rhythm, danger stalked the shadows. 3 young women, Sandra, Geraldine, would never return home from their nights out. Each was discovered lifeless, strangled, their futures stolen in the dark. The first body appeared in July. 16-year-old Sandra had vanished after leaving a club. Her body was found abandoned near a disused mine shaft, the violence of her death leaving police shaken. The community whispered of evil lurking close by, but no one could yet imagine the horror that was unfolding. Weeks later, in September, 2 more girls, Geraldine and Pauline, both only 16, were discovered in a wooded area not far from where they had been seen walking after a night of dancing. Their lives, too, had been ended with the same cruel method. The city changed overnight. Parents forbade their daughters from going out after dark. Taxi drivers reported panicked teenagers, desperate for safe rides. Detectives flooded the area, interviewing thousands, piecing together fragments of stories. Witnesses recalled a man, with thick hair and a mustache, driving an Austin 1100. One such car belonged to a local man whose name was mentioned early in the investigation. His alibi was thin, backed only by his wife. But with no evidence to tie him directly to the crimes, suspicion faded. And as time stretched on, the case went cold. For decades, the grief of the families never dimmed, but answers seemed out of reach. Then, in the early 2000s, a new tool emerged: DNA analysis. Traces preserved from the girls' clothing yielded a genetic profile. It matched no one in the criminal database. But detectives tried something bold. They looked for partial matches, hoping to find a relative of the killer. The search led them to a young man whose DNA suggested kinship, but his age ruled him out. Yet his father, a man once suspected, and long since dead, suddenly loomed large again. In the year 2002, investigators took an extraordinary step. They exhumed the father's body from his resting place in a Welsh cemetery. The night of the exhumation was stormy, thunder echoing as if nature itself disapproved. From the bones and teeth they collected, scientists extracted DNA. When the results came back, the match was absolute. Saturday Night Strangler, who had haunted Swansea's memory for 30 years, was finally unmasked. His name was Joseph Kappen. He had died in 1990, never held accountable, never questioned, after that first brush with suspicion. It was only through the relentless persistence of investigators and the power of genetic forensics that the truth emerged. Though Kappen escaped earthly justice, the families of Sandra, Geraldine, and Pauline were given the truth they had sought for so long. The case stands today not only as a tale of tragedy, but also as a milestone in the history of cold case investigation. A story where silence was finally broken, and a hidden killer revealed at last. In the summer of 1967, the city of Bristol carried on with its usual rhythm. Streets hummed with the sounds of neighbors chatting, children playing, and church bells ringing in the distance. Yet inside a modest home on Britannia Road, an elderly woman's life was cut short in an act of violence that would the community shaken for generations. Her name was Louisa Dunne, a 75-year-old widow who lived alone. She was known in her neighborhood as gentle, quiet, and content with the small rituals of daily life. But one night, the safety of her home was shattered. Louisa was found lifeless, her body showing signs of both strangulation and sexual assault. The brutality of the crime horrified the police and neighbors alike, sparking one of the largest investigations of its time. Officers scoured the area, interviewing thousands of men, and even collected palm prints from nearly 19,000 locals. Among the evidence, a single partial palm print was lifted from Louisa's window, a silent mark left by the intruder. Yet despite the immense effort, no match could be found. The killer seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. As the years passed, the case faded into the shadows, becoming one of Britain's longest running mysteries. But the passage of time did not erase the crime. Decades later, advances in forensic science offered new hope. In the early 2000s, detectives reopened the case and turned their attention to items preserved from that terrible night. On Louisa's skirt, forensic scientists discovered traces of semen that had survived more than half a century. From that evidence, a DNA profile was created, a genetic fingerprint of the killer. When the profile was run for the national database, it returned a match. Not to a stranger, but to a man whose DNA had been logged years earlier for an unrelated crime. Investigators also compared a fresh palm print taken from him with the one preserved from 1967. The match was undeniable. After 58 years, the man responsible for Louisa's death had finally been identified. In November of 2020, police made the arrest. The suspect was no longer the 34-year-old who had committed the crime, but a frail 92-year-old man living quietly in Suffolk. His name was Ryland Headley. Once a railway worker, he had lived an ordinary life in the eyes of neighbors. But hidden within that ordinary facade was a past marked by violence. Evidence presented in court revealed that he had also attacked two other elderly women in Ipswich during the late 1970s. The trial in Bristol was historic, not only because of its age, but because it demonstrated how science could outlast silence. In June of 2020, Headley was convicted of the murder of Louisa Dunne. The judge, unmoved by his advanced years, told him plainly that he would die in prison. Justice, though delayed for nearly 6 decades, had at last been delivered. For the people of Bristol, and for Louisa's family, the conviction brought a measure of closure. The mystery that had haunted the city since 1960 7 was no longer unsolved. Through persistence, careful preservation of evidence, and the power of DNA, the truth had emerged. The case stands today as a testament to the idea that even after a lifetime, justice can still find its voice. Late on a January night in 1980, the mountain roads near Breckenridge, Colorado, were swallowed by a blizzard so fierce, even headlights seemed afraid to shine. In that blanket of cold and white, 2 unsuspecting young women vanished into the night. One was Annette Schnee, aged 20, bright, hopeful, planning a life perhaps far beyond that isolated mountain town. The other was Barbara Oberholzer, aged 29, a mature woman with her own story to tell. Both had been hitchhiking home after work, sharing nothing in common but the fate that awaited them. Within hours, their bodies were found in places that seemed worlds apart yet linked by a single clue: an orange sock, stranded like a silent witness in the snow. For decades, the murders hummed over Park County, unsolved, haunting, whispered of in cold night air. Investigators chased every lead. Car descriptions, possible suspects, and dozens of interviews. Still no answers. Until nearly 40 years later, a spark of science flickered to life. In 2020, detectives turned to genetic genealogy. DNA from Bobby, Joe's bloodied glove, and a tissue locked away for nearly 4 decades, were submitted to a database normally used by families tracing their roots. A match emerged not from a known criminal, but from a family tree. A surname surfaced to Phillips. One brother living locally, the other far away. The next step was delicate. Detectives began watching a man from the town, silent, familiar to neighbors, with no outward hint of violence. To confirm their lead, they waited until he threw away a take-out bag from a local drive-in. Inside, a discarded napkin held his DNA. The results were conclusive. Blood on the glove belonged to him. He was arrested in early 2020. 1. Alan Lee Phillips, a miner and mechanic well known in the community. The twist remained unsettling. He was the very man rescued that same stormy night in 1980. 2. Pulled from a snowdrift after flashing his headlights in Morse code. At the time, rescuers saw bruises on his face and heard his story of being stranded. No one could have suspected then that he had stalked 2 women that very night. On a cold September day in 2020, a jury convicted Phillips of first-degree murder in the killings of Annette and Bobby Joe. He received 2 life sentences to be served, one after the other. Maximum justice for 2 lives so cruelly ended. Bathed in his quiet collapse, investigators summed it up: the crime, concealed under snow and years, illuminated only through perseverance and the power of DNA. Alan Lee Phillips died by suicide in prison the following year. The resolution came too late for the 2 women, yet for their families, it brought a painful peace. The truth, at last, laid bare beneath the snow that once swallowed their loved ones. On an April evening in 1960, the quiet of Vero Beach, Florida, was interrupted by a crime that would haunt the community for more than half a century. Hiram, Ross, Grayam, a World War II veteran and a loved neighborhood milkman, had set out on his familiar route. He was known for his kindness, often leaving, even when families could not pay, and for the discipline and resilience earned on battlefields far from home. That night, though, he would not return. When his family realized something was wrong, a search began. Police scoured the roads, and even a small airplane was dispatched to look for signs of his truck. The following morning, the searchers stumbled upon a chilling scene. In the woods' milk truck abandoned, and beside it, Ross himself, shot several times. His life had ended violently, far from the front lines of war, in the quiet community he had once protected with his service. The murder left investigators baffled and neighbors fearful. Who would kill a man like Ross, and why? The investigation began immediately. Witnesses recalled seeing Ross stop to speak with two men walking along the roadside. Before driving off with them, he told a friend he would be back shortly. Those would be his last known words. Detectives pursued leads. Suspects were questioned, but no charges were ever brought. Suspicion lingered over a handful of men, one in particular, but evidence was thin. The only certainty was the grief left behind. A family shattered, a son who grew up without his father, and a town that could not forget the milkman slain on his route. As the years slipped by, the case grew cold. Files gathered dust in the sheriff's office, while Ross's family held on to fading hope. Yet the story did not die. In 2006, a local newspaper printed a letter from a man named Thomas Williams, denying any role in the murder. His name had long been whispered in connection to the crime, but without proof, the denial carried weight. Williams continued his life, free from the shadow of the courtroom, while the Grayam family carried the weight of unanswered questions. It was only after Williams's death in 2016 that the silence began to break. In 2022, an inmate related to Williams came forward, revealing that the man had confessed years earlier to killing Ross. Around the same time, Williams's former wife also confirmed the confession. Both had stayed quiet while he lived, fearful of what he might do if they spoke. With him gone, the truth could finally emerge. The sheriff's office reopened the case, piecing together the testimony and the evidence preserved for decades. Though the suspect had escaped earthly justice, investigators were able to close the file at last, naming Williams as the man responsible. After more than 50 years, the family finally received the answer they had waited for Ross's son, who remembered the night his father never came home. The resolution was bittersweet. The man who had given so much, on foreign soil as a soldier, and at home as a gentle neighbor, was finally honored with truth. The case of Hiram, Ross, Grayam ended not with a trial, but with late confessions that spoke from beyond the grave. In the end, justice found its way, even if time had tried to bury it. On a cool April morning in 1981, along a quiet rural road near Troy, Ohio, 3 young men noticed something unusual. At first, it looked like a discarded coat, fringed and swaying in the breeze. But as they drew closer, the truth came into view. Beneath the buckskin poncho lay the body of a young woman, lifeless, curled as if in sleep. The discovery marked the beginning of a mystery that would stretch across nearly 4 decades. The young woman had striking features. Her reddish brown hair was braided neatly, her freckled face delicate and calm, despite the violence that had ended her life. She wore the distinctive buckskin with purple lining, a garment that would give her the name by which she became known, the Buckskin Girl. She had no shoes, no socks, and nothing to reveal her identity. Investigators collected fingerprints, dental impressions, and even preserved a vial of her blood. Yet despite every effort, no match could be made. She was a Jane Doe, remembered only by the clothing that wrapped her body. For years, detectives and volunteers refused to let her memory fade. Artists drew sketches of her face. Later computer reconstructions tried to recreate her likeness, and tests traced pollen and hair in the hope of finding where she had lived. Some clues suggested she had traveled through the western states. Others hinted at ties to the southeast or northeast. But every lead ended the same way, in silence. The Buckskin Girl became a symbol of unresolved loss, a question without an answer. Time moved on, but science moved forward. In the early 2000s, new methods of DNA testing began to reopen old doors. By 2018, the preserved blood taken from her in 1980 was submitted to a public genealogy database. Instead of looking for the killer, investigators searched for family. Within days, genealogists working with the DNA project built a family tree that led directly to relatives willing to share their DNA. At last, the young woman's true name emerged from the shadows. She was Marcia Lenore Sossaman King, 21 years old, from Little Rock, Arkansas. For 37 years, her family had waited without knowing. Her mother kept the same telephone number, hoping her daughter might call. Though her father and brothers had passed away, her stepmother and surviving relatives wept at the news that Marcia was finally found. Her grave, once marked only with Jane Doe, was given a new stone bearing her name. The revelation did not solve her murder, but it restored something equally vital: her identity. The girl who had been reduced to a coat and a nickname was once again Marcia, a daughter, a sister, a person whose life had meaning beyond her tragic end. Her case became one of the first powerful examples of how forensic genealogy could bring answers where none had existed before. For nearly 4 decades, the Buckskin Girl was a mystery. Today, she is remembered as Marcia King, her name spoken aloud, her dignity returned, her story no longer hidden in silence. On a hot July afternoon in the year 1960, a little girl played outside her grandmother's home in Alamogordo, New Mexico. She was 4 years old, full of energy, her life simple and bright. In an instant, her world was torn apart. A car pulled up, and strangers stepped out. A woman offered her candy and clothes. When she hesitated, she was taken by force, carried into the vehicle, and driven away. Her family's cries echoed into silence. 10 days later, more than 200 miles away, a schoolteacher walking through the Arizona desert spotted something unusual near a dry wash. At first, it seemed like a bundle of clothes left behind. As he drew nearer, the terrible truth revealed itself. The body of a small girl lay partly buried in the sand. Her sandals had been cut down to fit her tiny feet, her blouse and shorts still clinging to her. She had been killed and left in the desert heat, her name erased, her story silenced. The community of Prescott, Arizona, took the child into their hearts. They could not return her to her family, but they could honor her with dignity. Funds were raised, and more than 70 strangers came to her funeral. On her headstone, they carved the only name they knew: Little Miss Nobody. The words beneath read, "Blessed are the pure in heart." Detectives searched for answers. They recorded her fingerprints, preserved her teeth for comparison, and drew sketches to show her face. They combed through reports of missing children. Some thought she might a little girl taken from Alamogordo, but early estimates of her age placed her closer to 7 than 4. Without the tools to prove otherwise, investigators set aside the possibility. For decades, her grave remained a place of questions with no reply. In 2015, the determination to find her name brought new life to the case. Her body was exhumed, and scientists carefully collected DNA samples. Still, it would take more time before technology was ready to provide an answer. That moment came in 2020, when investigators turned to forensic genealogy. By comparing her DNA to distant relatives in public databases, they built family trees and traced the branches until one name emerged. The little girl in the desert was not Nobody. She was Sharon Lee Gallegos, a 4-year-old child who had been kidnapped from outside her grandmother's home in Alamogordo on July 21, 1960. 10 days later, she was found in the Arizona desert, but for 62 years no one had spoken her name. When the truth was announced, her family, still living, received it with both sorrow and gratitude. At last, she was returned to them in memory. She will now, rightfully, be given her name back, said the sheriff's office. Though her killer has never been found, the long silence has been broken. Sharon Lee Gallegos is no longer Little Miss Nobody. She is remembered as herself, a daughter, a niece, a child whose laughter once filled her home. Her dignity has been restored, her name carved forever into history, her story carried back into the light. On a May morning in 1960, a man searching along a Kentucky roadside for glass insulators noticed something unusual in the brush. Wrapped tightly in a green canvas, the kind used for tents, was the body of a young woman. The discovery shocked the quiet countryside. She had no name, no belongings. and no one who came forward to claim her. For years she would be known only as Tent Girl. Investigators tried everything they could at the time. They took fingerprints, made sketches of her face, and circulated descriptions through newspapers. People came to look, hoping to recognize her, but no answers followed. She was buried in Georgetown Cemetery, her headstone marked with the words, Tent Girl found May 17, 1968. Alongside the words was a simple drawing, meant to give her back some humanity. The stone was both a marker of respect and a reminder of the mystery that lingered. For nearly 3 decades, her story lay silent in police files and in the hearts of locals who never forgot her. Then, in the late 1990s, the case stirred again. Todd Matthews, an amateur sleuth, landed her through his father-in-law, who had been the one to discover her body years before. The story of the ill-identified woman weighed on him. Using the early internet, he created a page about Tent Girl, hoping that someone, somewhere, might recognize her story. In 1997, his search led him to a missing persons listing posted online by a woman searching for her sister. The details were hauntingly close. The missing woman was Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, who had vanished from Lexington, Kentucky, in 1967. She was only 24 years old when she disappeared, leaving behind a young daughter. Her family had spent years wondering what became of her. Investigators reopened the case and exhumed Tent Girl's remains. Advances in science provided what had been impossible in the 1960s: DNA testing. The results confirmed the truth. After 30 years, the young woman buried as Tent Girl finally had her name back. She was Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor. Her family traveled to see her resting place, placing a new marker beneath the old one that bore her real name and honor her as a loving mother, grandmother, and sister. Though the identity of the person responsible for her death was never formally proven, suspicion fell on her husband, George Earl Taylor, a carnival worker who'd never reported her missing. He had died years earlier, beyond the reach of justice. The case of Tent Girl became more than just a local story. It showed how determination and compassion, combined with new tools like the internet and DNA science, could breathe life into long, cold mysteries. Todd Matthews went on to help found the Network, an organization dedicated to identifying the unknown dead. Barbara's story, once hidden in silence and canvas, became a testament to perseverance. For 30 years she was Tent Girl, a nameless figure mourned by strangers. Today, she is remembered as Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, her name restored, her dignity returned, her story carried back to her family at last. On an October evening in 1980, the desert outside Las Vegas held a terrible secret. 2 brothers driving along a lonely road noticed something unusual in the brush. One of them, an off-duty police officer, slowed down and stepped out to look more closely. What he found silenced him. There, in the sand, lay the body of a young woman. She had been beaten, stabbed, and left alone beneath the desert sky. For the next 41 years, no one knew her name. She became known only as the Arroyo Grande Jane Doe. Her injuries spoke of cruelty. She had been struck in the head, stabbed in the back, and stripped of her clothing. A tooth was missing, and the marks of violence scarred her body. Near her was a piece of shower curtain, a strange clue that seemed to belong to another place entirely. On her forearm was a faint blue tattoo, the letter S, perhaps done by hand. On her nails shimmered layers of silver polish, a touch of care and personality in a life cut short. Investigators recorded her fingerprints, studied her teeth, and created sketches to imagine her face. None brought answers. She was buried under the name no one wanted for her, Jane Doe. For decades, detectives carried her story with them. Some retired, but the case never left their minds. In 2015, new attention brought her back into the public eye. Facial reconstructions were shared, hoping someone would remember. A cold case unit was formed, in part because of her. But the silence of the desert seemed unbroken. Then science offered what memory could not. By 2021, forensic genealogy had changed the way old mysteries could be solved. DNA preserved from her body was tested and uploaded to databases that mapped family trees. At last, threads appeared. Distant relatives linked by shared code. Step by step, investigators traced the branches back to one girl who had disappeared from Roswell, New Mexico. In December of that year, the truth was spoken aloud. The Arroyo Grande Jane Doe was not a stranger at all. She was Tammy Corinne Terrell, a 17-year-old who had last been seen at a restaurant in Roswell after attending the state fair. She had left in the company of a man and a woman. A week later, she was gone, her life stolen, and her name buried in the Nevada desert. For more than 4 decades, her family had wondered what became of her. Now they knew. Though the identity of her killer remains a mystery, Tammy's dignity has been restored. Her name, her story, her memory returned to the people who loved her. What was once the story of an unknown Jane Doe is now remembered as the life of Tammy Corinne Terrell. Her case stands as a testament to persistence, to science, and to the power of refusing to forget. For 41 years she was silent. Today she speaks again, not as Jane Doe, but as Tammy, a daughter, a teenager, a life once full of possibility.